The book of Revelations in 15 minutes. Something that I failed to do was kind of go through the 22 chapters of the book of Revelation. So I just wanted to give a quick chapter by chapter overlay. It's when I first started studying the scriptures. Romans was a great foundational book. You just kind of go through and what does chapter 1 mean? What does chapter 2 mean? So I'm going to quickly go through what I believe the main points, maybe a verse or two here or there, of the book of Revelation. You hear me talk about it all the time, the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 vials. But there's a lot more to the book of Revelation. And like I've said in the past, that there's a blessing promised in writing to those that read the book of Revelation. So in chapter 1, Jesus tells John to write a book, right? We get introduced to Jesus up in heaven. He tells him to write a book to the 7 churches of Asia. These were real churches. They existed at the time. But they also represent a couple different things. People say that those 7 churches have strengths and weaknesses. Those are all reviewed in chapters 2 and 3. The 7 churches are laid out. And each has strengths, each have weaknesses. Some things, some of the churches are threatened, and some of them are given remedies and how to fix those things that are bad. And those are in chapters 2 and 3. Couple things that you can do with that. Those were real churches at the time that had real problems and real strengths. You can spiritualize it in this way. It's spiritualized 2 different ways. If you look in the world today, there's 7 types of churches, right? There could be a Philadelphia type church, or there could be a Laodicean, or a Thyatira, or a Smyrna, right? Those 7 churches exist today in different forms around the world. But they also represent periods of time, right? So the first church spoken of in chapter 2, was the first time under the Ephesus church, and they have this great zeal. That was like the first church, Peter, James, John, Paul, the churches once they were established in Asia, and they go through like Philadelphia's around the 1600s is you see a lot of great things happening for the Word of God. You have the printing press, the King James Bible finished. 16 Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. That same time period, a little bit later in the Philadelphia time period, could be the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of America. Not that it was, there was a lot of struggles in how they got there, but there was a lot of positives too, and a very unique form of government was set up there in the 1700s. And the Philadelphia church has no warnings or problems associated with it. So then we get on. So the 7 churches, those are a couple things that you can look at. But we get to chapter 4, and John is called up to heaven, right? John's called up to heaven, and he's given a tour, and he's given a meet and greet, right? He sees heaven, and he sees all this different stuff that's going on in heaven, and he gets to meet a bunch of people, right? He gets to meet the 4 beasts and the 4 types of beasts that have wings and all the eyes in the wings, the 4 and 20 elders, and it's a meet and greet, and it's a tour, and John gets to see that up there in heaven. Chapter 5, there's a book found, right? This book is found, and it has 7 seals, and no one is able to open the book. No one is found in heaven, in earth, or below the earth that can open the book. And we see here that the Lamb that was slain shows up and says he is worthy, and he will open the book. And that is really the essence of chapter 5 is the introduction of a book, a prophecy with 7 seals. And it says it's written within and on the back. Chapter 6 deals with the first 6 seals, right? The first 4 seals are the 4 different horsemen. So the first horse white, second seal with the red, the third seal is the black horse, 4th seal is the pale horse, the 5th seal is those that are sealed under the altar in martyrdom on a large scale, and then the 6th seal at the end of chapter 6, where the earthquake, the sun goes dark, and the moon, and cataclysmic events, wrapping up the 6th seal. And then there's what I call the first interlude in chapter 7. And John is cut away, and he's in heaven. He's looking down on the earth for the 7 seals. And then in chapter 7, we get this interlude, and we get the sealing of the 144,000. And he gets to see things in heaven, but it's really the sealing of the 144,000 is what John sees there, is how all of Israel will be saved. And then chapter 8 is the 7th seal, right? The 7th seal is opened, and the angels are given 7 trumpets, and the 7th seal in chapter 8, verse 5, you're going to see that ties into Revelation 16:18. That's one of those ties I talked about, that the seventh seal ties in with the seven vials and the ending of the 7-year tribulation period. And you see that in verse 5, Revelation chapter 8, verse 5, tying in with Revelation 16, verse 18, word for word, what's happening there. But you see 7 angels are given 7 trumpets, and then the 7 trumpets sound, right? So we have the first trumpet sounding. Let me just make sure I check my notes here. Chapter 8 and 9 are the first 6 trumpets, right? Just like we had the first 6 seals open in an interlude, we're now going to have 6 trumpets sound in an interlude. So you have the first trumpet sounding, and that's the trees burning up and all the grass. The second trumpet sounds, and that one is the mountain with fire thrown into the sea, a third of the sea turning to blood, a third of the ships destroyed, and a third of the fish are dying. The third trumpet sounds, and that's wormwood thrown to the earth, hitting the fountains of waters, and the waters become bitter, and many men die because of the bitter waters. And then you have the fourth trumpet sounding, which is a third of the sun, a third of the moon, a third of the stars going dark. That's where Jesus, we studied yesterday with Matthew, if those days were not shortened, no flesh should be saved. And then the fifth angel sounds, and this is the opening of the bottomless pit. The angel comes down with a key, and he opens up the bottomless pit, and these scorpions come out of the earth. That whole chapter dealing with the scorpions on the earth, or half the chapter is dealing with the scorpions on the earth, tormenting men for 5 months. And then halfway through, you have the sixth angel sounding, and they're messing with Euphrates, and some beasts are let out. Some really powerful beasts are let out. That's a whole other study outside of my expertise and realm. But there were 4 beasts reserved for this day in the Euphrates, and they're let go. So then that's the 6 trumpets. And now here we have a second interlude, just like the first time where you have 6 seals open in an interlude. Now we have the 6 trumpets sounding, and then we have an interlude. In chapter 10, John's given a book to eat, and he's just told that he has to go before many nations, and he still has to prophesy. It would be sweet in his mouth and bitter in his belly. But what's interesting is chapter 10, verse 7 is a foretelling of what happens when the 7th trumpet sounds, right? That the kingdoms of this world, it's the end. It's the catching away of the church there in verse 6 and 7. Just a little brief, hey, this is about to happen, is the sounding of the 7th trumpet, and what that means. So then we get on to chapter 11, and chapter 11, John is measuring the temple, right? Just an interlude. This is the temple. Let's measure it. Let's see how big it is. But we also talk about, in this chapter, we are introduced to the 2 witnesses, and they're going to preach for 3.5 years. They're going to be killed after preaching by the king of the beast that come out in trumpet number 5. That king, it doesn't come out of the beast. The king is here on the earth, but he is going to be in charge of those beast critters, those scorpion, men, horse, whatever those are. There's going to be an earthly king ruling over those beasts, and they're going to make war. That king is going to make war, and you see that here in chapter 11 with the 2 witnesses, and he's going to kill the 2 witnesses. He's going to prevail, just like Satan is going to prevail during the tribulation period until Christ finishes it. We see that this king is able to make war with the 2 witnesses and kill them. 3.5 years preaching, holding up heaven, and then they're left in the street for 3.5 days. The spirit of life comes back into them, and they go up into the cloud. And that's in verse 12. You'll see them go up into the cloud. And then in verse 14 and 15 is the sounding of the last trumpet and the catching away of the church. And that is where we're taken away. So now we have another interlude, right? Because now we have the 7 trumpets complete and the catching away of the church. We have a third interlude in chapter 12. And what John gets to say is, here's some signs in heaven that are happening. and you'll see they're happening during that 7 years, not at this point forward, but sometime during the 7 years. Chapter 12 is taking place. It's the signs in heaven. Chapter 13 talks about the beast and his system. And again, that's talking from the 3.5 years on, the Antichrist and the power that he's given. Chapter 14, we see the initial fall of Babylon. Later on, we'll see a more complete picture of the fall of Babylon. But we see here that this is the end where the fall of Babylon takes place. And then at the end of chapter 14, we see Christ in the cloud, and he is harvesting. He's harvesting the sheep in the final harvest, and he's harvesting the grape for the wrath of God. Chapter 15 talks about the blessings of martyrdom. So it's a neat little short chapter, 8 verses. I think it's the shortest chapter in the book of Revelation. And it just talks about the sea of glass and some of the blessings that you receive from martyrdom during this tribulation dispensation. So if you want to see you're alive right now, if you're saved, then you're going to have one of two things. There could be martyrdom, or you can endure to the end. So if you want to see the blessings of martyrdom, look in chapter 15, and you can see one of the many blessings of being killed for the testimony of Jesus Christ during this dispensation of tribulation. So then in chapter 16, we get the 7 vials, because at the end of chapter 14, you see them making the vials, the blood and those vials. And then in chapter 16, the 7 vials are full, and they're poured out. It just says angels go. This is the wrath of God. The first one is poured out, and men have sores, and it's not. And then all the sea, everything in the sea dies, everything, and all the sea is blood. And then all the waters of the world, and men are forced to drink blood. And this really bothers the angels. They're like, we're glad that you're holy, true, and just, Lord, because this is a grievous. All water is turned to blood, and the wicked are made to drink of the blood of the saints and the martyrs at that point. And then the sun, an angel goes into the sun, and it causes men to burn. And then the seed of the beast is turned to darkness again, and we're seeing that again with Babylon. And then drying up of Euphrates, and unclean spirits. And then 17 to 18, done. 7 vials done. This is done. 7 vials are now poured out. And now the rest of Revelation is really dealing with the judgment seat of Christ, the judgment, the white throne judgment. Chapter 17 is dealing with the judgment of the whore and her system. Chapter 18 and chapter 14 go together, is the fall of the Babylon. Right? And it's just talking about, 18 just gives a little bit more detail about the fall and the collapse of Babylon. Chapter 19, the first half is the marriage and the marriage supper. Some slight variations there that I'm not going to get into right here, but it's those that are invited to the marriage of the Lamb and those that are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then the second half of chapter 19 is the Battle of Armageddon. Christ comes out on the white horse, the vesture, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, sword comes out of his mouth, destroys all his enemies, the birds of the field, just eat everything up. Ezekiel talks about this, it's going to take 7 months to bury the dead after this battle. It'll be 7 years to clean up all the armaments. And if you look up videos of all the armaments that are being shipped to that European theater right now, that's going to be used against Israel, it's quite amazing. And you can see where it would take a small group of people 7 years to clean up that mess. And so that's chapter 19. Chapter 20 deals with the 1,000-year reign of Christ, right? And that's the first time you'll really see Gog and Magog in the New Testament. It's talking about in the Old Testament, but at the end of the 1,000 years, Gog and Magog are spoken about, which are the isles of the Japhethites, which is the isles of the north, which is the people that went to the north after Noah's flood. That's Magog. It's one of the kings it's one of the sons of Japheth off the flood. And that happens at the end of the 1,000 years. Chapter 21, we see the new heaven and the new earth. That's where the new heaven and new earth is. And going forward, right? Sin is cast into, the bottomless pit, is cast into outer darkness. It's all wrapped up. And then in chapter 22, eternity future, after the 1,000 years. And then there's time no more, right? So that's where you go forth in chapter 22. I just wanted to briefly outline that because I know people say, oh, look what's happening in Russia. We got Gog and Magog. That's not until the end of the 1,000 years, folks. right now, like I said, in September of 2020 was the first seal. The second seal was broken last September. And you can see that because it'll all be wrapped up. A lot of people say that Christ fulfilled the spring feast and holy days of Israel at his first coming, and that he'll fulfill the fall feast and celebrations that the Jewish people have in the fall, which would be the second coming, which would tie in with September and that 7-year time period, right? So I believe the first trumpet is sounded. I believe the second trumpet is in the process of sounding. And so what are we looking for? We're looking for the two witnesses to show up. We're looking for that one world religion to establish itself. The third seal will open September, hyperinflation. You got 2 years, really, before the Antichrist really forces, and there'll be no options or ability to buy or sell without the mark of the beast. Why do I say that? Again, I said it in my first video, start growing some food. Most people have life insurance, they have car insurance, they have homeowners insurance, they have, I know people that have insurance on their snow machines, they have insurance on everything, but they don't have, they're not prepared. And we're going to talk later today. I'm going to try to do the second half of Matthew 24, and then we're going to get into Matthew 25, which is dealing with the 10 virgins. And if you go look at that, those are 10 people that are invited, if you will, to the marriage supper of the Lamb. Those are believers. 5 come prepared and 5 don't. The 5 that don't get let in. And I think that's a very important lesson for the days that we live in. Anyway, that's the 22 chapters of Revelation. I challenge you to go just read it. It takes about an hour to read it. Just read it every Sunday morning. Read it every day if you can. Just read it through. And you'll receive a blessing from the Lord by reading that one book. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to talking to you about the second half of Matthew.